I don't believe in alien life. I believe that God showed me a specific answer to two prayers, that they're demonic.
Charles Duke stood on the moon. 6 kilometers from his lunar module, on the far side of a ridge where Earth couldn't see, he found a wall. Ancient, deliberate, built before human beings existed. He photographed it. Houston went silent, then told him to keep moving. Those photographs have never been released. For 50 years, Duke said nothing, because that was the agreement, spoken or not, between every man who walked the lunar surface and the agency that sent them there. Now, at 90, the agreement is over, and what he's saying changes everything you thought you knew about why Apollo ended. The astronaut. To understand why this matters, you need to understand who Charles Duke is. Not an anonymous tipster, not a retired engineer with a grudge, Air Force Brigadier General, test pilot with thousands of flight hours. One of the most technically precise human beings NASA ever trained. On July 20th, 1969, Duke was sitting at the Capcom console in Houston when Neil Armstrong guided the Eagle down toward the Sea of Tranquility. The landing radar was throwing error codes, the computer was overloading, fuel was running low. Duke's voice was the last thing Armstrong heard before the footpads hit the dust. "Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again." That was Duke, calm under impossible pressure, the kind of man who doesn't embellish, doesn't exaggerate, doesn't invent. 3 years later, he got his own mission, Apollo 16, April 1972. He and Commander John Young would spend 71 hours on the lunar surface, traversing the Descartes Highlands, collecting samples, running experiments. NASA called it one of the most successful Apollo flights ever. Duke came back different. He finished the debrief, did the interviews, smiled for the cameras. On paper, exactly the man he'd always been. Decorated, precise, unflappable. The Air Force doesn't produce men who crack. NASA doesn't select astronauts who invent things. That's the entire reason his silence meant something. And that's the entire reason, now that the silence is over, you have to pay attention. For 4 decades, he said nothing.
So John they dumped all the data down and said, well, we'll look at it.
He watched Neil Armstrong retreat from public life entirely, giving almost no interviews, never once discussing what he saw up there beyond the scripted answers. He watched other astronauts begin speaking carefully in retirement, obliquely, always with an exit ramp back to respectability. He watched the culture around unexplained phenomena shift from punchline to congressional hearing. He waited, and somewhere in his late 80s, he made a decision that clearly cost him something. He started talking. And he didn't start with the biggest thing. He started with what had been eating at him the longest, the details that violated everything he understood about physics, the things he couldn't explain away no matter how long he tried. The anomalies. The light was wrong. Sunlight on the moon should be pure white, no atmosphere to scatter it, no particles to bend it. That's not theory, it's basic physics. And Duke knew it before he ever climbed into the lunar module. But through his visor, patches of color bloomed across the regolith where color had no right to exist. Blues, deep purples, pooling on the dust in shifting patterns like something was filtering the light from above. He'd turn away, look back, different color, different location, slow, deliberate. He didn't report it. You don't write in the mission log that sunlight is the wrong color on the airless moon. You keep moving and tell yourself there's an explanation you're not seeing. Then the sound started. Sound can't travel on the moon. No air, no atmosphere, no medium for pressure waves. Duke knew every mechanical hum his suit produced. These weren't those. Low, resonant frequencies. Sometimes harmonic, almost musical, cycling through patterns. Sometimes jagged and discordant, like something searching for the right frequency and failing to hold it. The vibrations came up through his boots, through the regolith itself, resonating in his chest before he consciously registered them as sound. He turned to John Young. "You hearing that?" Young went quiet. Then, yeah, I hear it. 2 of the most rigorously trained men on the planet. Same phenomenon, neither reported it. Because what do you write in the mission log? Heard music on the airless moon? They both knew exactly how that would sound. So they kept moving, kept collecting samples, kept pretending that the ground beneath their boots wasn't humming with something that had no right to be there. And then, time broke. Not metaphorically. Duke would run a geological task, bag a sample, photograph the site, move to the next marker, check his suit timer, and 20 minutes had vanished. Felt like 2. Other times, a 5-minute traverse stretched into what felt like an hour, every step sluggish, like pushing through something thick and invisible. Young experienced the same distortion. Their subjective time never once matched the mission clock across 71 hours on the surface. Duke filed it, kept moving, told himself fatigue, told himself altitude, told himself something about the way the human brain processes time in an alien environment. He had a checklist to finish, he had a mission to complete. You don't stop on the surface of the moon to process a philosophical crisis. And then there was the presence, not a figure, not a shadow, a pressure, the awareness of something enormous just beyond perception, watching with an intelligence that felt older than anything Duke had a frame of reference for. Not Houston, not equipment, something that had been there long before Duke arrived and would be there long after he left. Something that registered his existence the way you might register an ant crossing your path, with awareness but without urgency. Every astronaut who walked on the moon will tell you the same thing if they're honest, Duke said, his voice dropping. You feel observed, not by Houston, something vast, something aware, something paying attention. Strange light that moved like it was alive. Sounds in the ground of a world with no air. Time that stuttered and bent. The weight of being watched by something that dwarfed human comprehension. Each one alone, explainable. All of them together, confirmed by 2 astronauts across 71 hours. That's not a glitch. That's a pattern. If this is already blowing your mind, subscribe, because what Duke found 6 kilometers from the lander makes everything you just heard look like a warm-up. The structures.
50 years ago this week, the world watched as the Apollo 11 crew lifted off and then landed on the moon a few days later.
In 2019, a journalist asked Duke directly, "Did you see anything on the moon that NASA has never publicly acknowledged?" The room went dead silent. Duke's jaw tightened. He held the interviewer's gaze for a long moment. Yes, absolutely yes. Standard geological traverse, Descartes, highlands, roughly 6 kilometers from the lunar module. The far side of a ridge, no direct line of sight to Earth, no one watching. Duke caught something on the horizon, a shape, too straight, too regular. He called it out. Young stopped the rover. Neither man said anything. They drove closer. Under the flat, shadowless glare of unfiltered sunlight, it resolved into something that made Duke's stomach drop. A wall, or the exposed top of a foundation, rising from the regolith in angular, block-like segments. Lunar dust clung to it in a fine gray skin, same color as everything around it, which is why they almost missed it. Where the rover's lights cut across the surface, Duke saw edges. Clean, deliberate edges, right angles, joints where segments met with mechanical precision. Not erosion patterns, not geological fracturing, construction. It stretched roughly 100 meters across the terrain, then disappeared into the surface at both ends, descending at angles that, said clearly, you're only seeing the top of this. Whatever the full structure was, millions of years of dust and micrometeorite impact had buried most of it. He radioed Houston immediately. What followed was silence. Not the standard 2.6-second Earth-Moon communication lag. Much longer, the kind of pause that doesn't happen by accident in a room full of engineers tracking every second of a mission timeline. Then a voice came back, flat, controlled, deliberate. Continue with planned sample collection. No acknowledgement, no questions. No describe what you're seeing. No coordinates, no excitement. No loop in the geology team. Just move on. Duke and Young took photographs anyway, dozens of them. Wide-angle context shots, close-ups of the joints between blocks, detail shots capturing the shadow geometry. Duke moved around the structure methodically, shooting from multiple angles. He framed every image like evidence, because that's exactly what it was. If anyone was going to look at these later and try to argue geology or pareidolia or trick of the light, he wanted to make that argument impossible. And get this, Duke knew in real time that Houston's silence wasn't confusion. Experienced mission controllers don't go quiet when astronauts report something unexpected. That's the opposite of how they're trained. They ask questions, they loop in geologists, they say, read me your coordinates. They want more data, more description, more of everything. The silence wasn't a technical delay. It was a decision, made fast by someone with the authority to make it. Those photographs were never released. Duke has asked NASA about them repeatedly in the decades since. The explanations rotate, classified for technical reasons, lost during archival transfer, too poor in quality to be useful. His answer has never changed. I took those photos. I know what I saw through that viewfinder. They were perfectly clear, somewhere, possibly in a vault, possibly in a filing cabinet that hasn't been opened since the Nixon administration. NASA may be holding photographic evidence of artificial structures on the lunar surface. And if that evidence exists, it has been buried for over 50 years. Not misplaced, not forgotten. Buried. The age. The journalist asked the follow-up. Did the structures look recent? Duke's expression changed. Something behind his eyes shifted, from careful disclosure to something closer to dread. No. And that's what makes this terrifying. The surfaces were covered in micro-craters, the kind that only accumulate over geological time scales on an airless world with nothing to erode them. On Earth, craters get worn down by wind, rain, vegetation, tectonic movement. On the Moon, nothing softens them. Every impact stays exactly as it lands, forever. The density of those craters is a clock, and the clock on those surfaces said, ancient. Not decades, not centuries. The dust layering around the base was deep and completely undisturbed. The way lunar dust only looks when it has been settling, grain by grain, for millions of years, with nothing ever disturbing it. Whatever Duke and Young found had been there since before human beings existed, before language, before fire, before the first upright step on the African savanna, before the dinosaurs, possibly before complex life on Earth at all, before the Cambrian explosion, before anything that would eventually become us. I don't know who built them, Duke said, but something constructed on the Moon long before we existed, and NASA knows, and they decided the public shouldn't. Here's what makes that even harder to process. On the Moon, nothing decays. There's no oxygen to rust metal, no water to rot wood, no biology to consume anything organic, no weather to erode stone. Things persist on the Moon exactly as they were left, which means whatever built those structures, the evidence is still up there, in exactly the same condition it was in, when it was abandoned, whenever that was. Preserved perfectly in the airless silence of a world where time effectively stopped. The question isn't whether it existed. Duke and Young both saw it. Duke photographed it. The question is what it was, and who decided the rest of us didn't deserve to know. The others. Duke isn't alone, and that's the part that makes dismissal impossible. In 2017, most of the surviving Apollo moonwalkers gathered privately. No cameras, no NASA handlers, no press. Just the men who had been there, the only human beings alive who truly understood what the others had experienced. According to Duke, it was the first time they allowed themselves to have the conversation they'd all been quietly avoiding for decades. Everyone had anomalies, Duke said. Different missions, different things. But nobody's experience matched the official story. And we all knew we couldn't talk about it. Not because NASA threatened, but because no one would have believed us. Here's the catch. They didn't just nod along to each other's stories. The details matched. Men who hadn't compared notes, who had been carefully silent for decades, describing the same categories of experience from different missions, different landing sites, different years, the colored light, the sounds in the ground, the time distortion, the presence, independent corroboration from the most credible witnesses in the history of space exploration. Buzz Aldrin, a man who walked the Moon before Duke, spoke publicly about a monolith discovered on Phobos, one of Mars's moons, and suggested with visible unease that it was artificial in origin. Edgar Mitchell, Apollo 14, returned from the Moon and spent the rest of his life openly convinced that extraterrestrial intelligence had engaged with Earth, not as speculation, but as personal conviction formed from direct experience. Al Worden, command module pilot on Apollo 15, stated his belief that human origins traced back to ancient visitors, that we have always been visited, that the evidence is there if you're willing to look at it. These weren't men who cracked under the pressure of fame. These were men who held classified information for decades, who knew exactly what they could and couldn't say, and who in the last years of their lives made a deliberate choice to say it anyway. Free from institutional gravity, free from career consequences, left with nothing to protect except the truth as they understood it. And they all arrived at the same place. the official story isn't incomplete in minor ways. It's incomplete in ways that change everything about what human beings are and where we sit in the history of this solar system. The real reason. In 2023, Duke was asked point blank, "Is there a cover-up?" Not in the conspiracy sense, he said. It's institutional paralysis. Here's what he means by that. NASA isn't run by villains. It's run by scientists and engineers and administrators who are as human as anyone else, which means they are capable of the same ordinary cowardice that stops most people from saying the hard thing. They have data, photographs, instrument readings, observations from multiple missions that collectively suggest the moon is far stranger than the dead rock story sold to the public for 50 years. To release that information isn't just admitting they withheld something. It's detonating the entire framework through which most people understand humanity's place in the universe. So they sit on it. He paused. It's not malicious, it's cowardice. Duke was asked what he believes would happen if NASA released everything. He didn't answer directly. He just shook his head, said, "People aren't ready." Then quieter. Maybe they never will be. But that's not their decision to make. And then the answer this entire story has been building toward. We could have continued, Duke said, built lunar bases, sent dozens more missions, really investigated what's there. The technology existed, the will existed. After Apollo 11, the whole world was watching. The infrastructure, the momentum, the institutional knowledge was all in place. We were 1 decade into human spaceflight, and we had already landed on another world. The trajectory was clear. And then it stopped. After Apollo 17 in December 1972, we barely went back for 50 years. No permanent presence, no bases, no return to the Descartes Highlands. The greatest technological achievement in human history was quietly shelved. The official explanation, budget constraints. That's what they told Congress. That's what they told the press. That's what got written into the history books. The real reason, the people making decisions realized the moon raised questions they couldn't answer. Who was there before us? What those structures mean? Whether we're alone? And it was easier to stop going than to confront what was being found. Easier to walk away. Easier to point at budget lines and let the public believe it was about money. They closed the file. They let the rocket sit. They let the question answer itself with silence. And silence, it turns out, is an answer most people will accept. The testimony. I walked on the moon. I saw things that aren't in any official report. I'm telling you because you deserve to know. Charles Duke is 90 years old. He spent his entire adult life inside institutions where credibility was the only currency that mattered, where you didn't say things you couldn't document, didn't report what you couldn't defend, didn't break from the official account no matter how hard the official account strained against what you actually saw. 50 years of keeping the unwritten agreement, 50 years of giving the interviews NASA expected, staying in the lane marked safe, carrying what he carried quietly. He is not a man prone to fantasy. He is not seeking attention. He doesn't need the money, doesn't need the validation, doesn't need to be believed by people who weren't there. He's 90. He's lived his whole life inside systems of accountability. What he's doing now, saying these things plainly and on the record, is the single most credible thing he could possibly do with the time he has left. Because it's the thing that costs him the most. The structures are still there. The photographs are still in some archive. The questions have never been answered. One of only 12 humans who ever stood on the moon is saying NASA buried the evidence. So, what else haven't they told us? Drop your theory in the comments and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.